feel like this is an odd choice of a topic to make a video on, since this is a rather old game at this point, and I do feel that considering how short and sweet this story is, it's quite obviously been touched on to some degree. To be completely honest, I'm mostly making this video because I find this story very touching and emotionally gripping, but also I'm trying to get used to multitasking with video content. I'm hopefully going to be working on multiple projects at a time, just so I have a backlog that helps me when I'm low on ideas. Before we delve into this tugging story, I did want to briefly mention Yoshiaki Koizumi, who was the writer for this story and in many of Nintendo's games. Although Nintendo tends to not pride or worry themselves too heavily with deep story elements, I noticed with Yoshiaki that he seems to like to sprinkle innovative ideas in when he can. I believe he worked on the story for Majora's Mask, so that is really endearing that there are employees at Nintendo that even as early as the 90s had really powerful intentions of creating intriguing stories. I would perhaps like to do more research on figures within the projects that we cover. I think that can make for some interesting discussion surrounding how a product is made and what led these people to carve the paths they make within their stories. Starting with a brief overview, Rosalina's storybook is about a girl who finds a star being that we know as the Lumas. They go on a spacefaring journey to seek out and find the Luma's mother. As the story unfolds, however, we actually find out a decent amount about Rosalina in this short period of time. It's vague and splotchy, but it gives us a slight understanding of the life she may have been living previous to this story taking place. I think the first thing that sticks out about the girl is that she immediately has this sort of empathetic connection with the Luma. She promises she will wait with the Luma, and they do a pinky promise. Well, Pinky and Stana promise. So we know that the girl is perhaps old enough to experience complex empathy, yet young enough to have a certain naivete attached to her actions. I mean, the narrator mentions beforehand that she is using her father's telescope, so we would possibly get the impression that if she were to dedicate all of her time to this Luma's mission, that she is missing out on the relationship with her family. I do think it's quite important to preface that we don't actually know what the situation is with Rosalina's father and brother, since they are mentioned. However, the story focuses much more on her relationship to her mother, and that culminates in finding out about her mother's fate. So we don't have any clue what Rosalina's life was like on her home planet, other than what we see with her mother. Before we move on, I want to briefly seep the idea into everyone's head that I believe there is an honest theme of sacrifice in this short story, and at the start that is represented through the girl's willingness to help this poor Luma, in spite of that she might not have much to offer, and in spite of what she may lose. This idea of sacrifice in the name of connection and legacy will pay off later in the story with the Lumas, and I think ultimately this theme of the galaxy within Super Mario Galaxy really fits in so neatly with Rosalina's story, because like her mother, Rosalina is full of compassion and empathy and sacrifice, and so Rosalina takes on that same role her mother perhaps did for her, but for the Lumas instead. The Lumas then feed the cycle by sacrificing for Rosalina's happiness, like a star that is reborn in a cycle within the universe. When the girl and Luma set off on their celestial journey, we get to see how the girl is still very much a young, naive child. She stuffs her belongings, which contains a butterfly net, a stuffed bunny, milk, bread, jam, and apricot flavoured tea. She forgets water, which the Luma finds rather amusing. I do think that with the short time we have with these characters, we are getting to see a bond form, and this bond is actually one of maturity that is setting up for a role that this girl will later take on as she grows. In Chapter 4, we enter the girl's dream to witness her mother standing in front of us with an ethereal glow. The scene actually gives us some chunks of information on the type of person the girl's mother was. She was of course the child's mother, but also as a mother acted as a filter and a guide through this dim and treacherous world. She says, "I'm always watching over you like the sun in the day and the moon in the night." We get to see a very vulnerable side of the girl who clearly treated her mother with unworldly levels of respect. I really like this scene. It's very bittersweet, since we do get the impression that her mother has become this looming presence in her life rather than a physical entity. However, even in this understanding, we know she provides wisdom and compassion to her daughter. Once the girl and Luma have wiped away their heartfelt tears, they begin to explore further and choose to settle down, building the Comet Observatory as we know it. I do think that this is when we first start to see the girl taking on this motherly role. She's really starting to consider the words her mother has given her and realise that those ideas spurted from her mother's mouth deeply apply to how she can raise her starry friend. When an apricot-looking planetary body appears during tea time, we meet another luma that begins referring to the girl off the bat as Mama. I do want to quickly look at the use of the plant apricot being mentioned twice now. I know this story was written in a whim of creative spark, so I do think I'm likely looking into it way too much, but when searching for what apricots typically mean in different cultures, it seems they are associated with happiness and prosperity. I think it's more likely that it is just installing a sense of childlike joy within the reader. Apricot is sweet and quite homey, which encapsulates what the Comet Observatory becomes, but I might be reaching a bit. Now, when getting back to the main topic of this chapter, we then see the girl surrounded by dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of lumas, and so she decides to adopt each and every one. We then move on to chapter 7, which is undoubtedly the most heart-wrenching and memorable. The girl gets out of her father's telescope and peers through to find her home planet, and a spot where she would go on to reminisce many of her fondest memories with her now lost family. She goes on to think of the time she would gaze upon the stars with her father, almost mirroring what she has now become by looking at that old spot with a new perspective, one of her mother's and perhaps even her father. We see some of that in this short story, the girl's past life, being a naive, independent little girl, and now her ascent into everything her mother embodied. The girl begins to burst into tears thinking of her family, as one would when faced with the idea that you may well never see them again. This is when we get the lines, "I know she's not there, I knew all along that she wasn't out there, in the sky, because she's sleeping under the tree on the hill." It hits really hard no matter how many times I've read this story. It's a very simple telling of longing and grief from a child's perspective, yet it still stings each and every time. The main luma we have spent the narrative with says, "It's like me, I love star bits because they remind me of my mother." I think this line is quite a poignant thing for the luma to say, since I always interpreted it as the luma saying this due to the girl being reminded of her mother when around the lumas, since she had taken on a motherly role. The luma, in a rush to figure out what they can do to wither the girl's woes away, decides to transform into a comet that can allow the Comet Observatory to traverse around the universe, visiting her homeworld every 100 years. This is also when we find out that in a general sense the luma's destiny is to transform into a star, comet or planet, which is sort of the ultimate sacrifice. I remember as a kid always feeling quite distraught that the lumas had to lose a part of themselves to feel fulfilled. But I think in viewing the storybook slightly more thoroughly, we see that there is at least some level of love and happiness to come out of these cataclysmic events. A really interesting quote from one of the lumas is, "When I grow up, I want to become a star that makes someone special smile." And besides being the most adorable words uttered from somebody, it does show that the lumas find a lot of happiness in providing and sacrificing for the prosperity of others. I mean, we know that life could be supported on planets, so when the luma says this, I believe they are referring to a future scenario where perhaps living beings are happy living on it due to its own sacrifice. The last quote I want to cover is one that I think sums up a lot of the girl's journey to motherhood. "This is my family now, and I will stay with them until they are ready to leave the nest, and when they do leave, I'll see them off with a smile, because that's what makes a mother happiest." I actually think this quote encapsulates what I've been trying to say much better than I could, that the girl now understands who her mother was, and that she has come to fill a similar role with the lumas, and in some ways with even more benevolence. Since she decides to adopt hundreds and hundreds of lumas, she is now the Rosalina we all know and adore. Hope you enjoyed the video. I thought this would be a bit of a shorter video for the time being. I want to work on more long form content. I've been playing some games recently, trying to just kind of gauge what I'm interested in. I might do a video on the Walking Dead Telltale series, or the video game Mouthwashing. I might even throw in some videos on Dead by Daylight, the tomes. So just comment what's interesting really. Any suggestions will do. I hope you enjoyed the video, and bye.